For over 2,500 years, the teachings of the Buddha have inspired millions across cultures, continents, and generations. But along the way, stories have morphed, myths have emerged, and images have evolved, often blending fact with fiction. We've all seen these serene statues, the half smile, the long earlobes, and yes, the perfectly smooth or tightly curled head. But how much of that is historical truth and how much is artistic invention? Welcome to the Bodhi Files, a series where I dive into common myths, mysteries, and misconceptions about Buddhism. Today, we begin with episode 1. Was the Buddha bald? Now, as you may know already, any man or woman who intends to renounce the worldly life and enter the Sangha, that is, the monastic community, has to shave their heads. According to the Vinaya, the monastic code of discipline, Buddhist monks and nuns are required to shave their heads at least every 2 months, or when the hair has grown to a length of 2 finger breadths, whichever occurs first. This rule is intended to discourage vanity and elaborate grooming practices that were prevalent in ancient India. Historically, long, fragrant, and ornate hairstyles were key indicators of wealth and aristocracy for both men and women. So, by shaving their heads, monks and nuns reject wealth and social status to embrace non-attachment and the release of personal identity. One of the most obvious fallacies of Buddhism is the depiction of the Buddha with a full head of hair. In paintings seen across Asia, there's an incongruous contrast between the Buddha and his disciples. Apparently, the Buddha is the only one who doesn't shave his head. For Buddhists like myself who have grown up in 2 cultures where the shaven head is exclusively associated with monasticism, it raises a curious question. If the Buddha himself represented the very idea of monasticism, why isn't he shaven like the rest of his disciples? Now, I believe he was shaven. Let's start with the sources. The earliest textual records of the Buddha's life don't spend much time describing his appearance, but there are multiple discourses in the Pali Canon in which the Buddha is described as indistinguishable from other monks. In the Samanyapala Sutta, the king of Magadha, Ajatasattu, was unable to pick the Buddha out of a crowd of monks. In the Dhatu Vibhanga Sutta, the king of Gandhara, who had just given up his kingdom and gone forth into homelessness, spent the night in a shed alone with the Buddha, but did not recognize him, initially thinking him to be just another fellow mendicant. It was only after the Buddha expounded the law of dependent origination to the former king that he attained the 3rd stage of enlightenment and realized who he was sharing the shed with. There are multiple other discourses in the Pali Canon that also hint that the Buddha was indeed bald. We see it here and also here. Many Buddhists are taught that prior to his enlightenment, the Buddha, then known as Prince Siddhartha, cut off his hair, donned the robes of a mendicant, and formally renounced worldly life along the banks of the Anoma River. So, generally speaking, if we are to conclude all of this based on the information in the Pali Canon, it seems that the Buddha looked like a monk to most people. Yet, there hasn't been a single depiction of the Buddha as a bald ascetic. So the question is, why? You see, the Buddha wasn't depicted in human form for centuries after his death. Ancient Buddhists used symbols like a wheel, a footprint, or a lotus to represent the Buddha, but never the Buddha himself. Buddhist art in the very beginning was aniconic. The Buddha was represented by mere symbols. I mean, just take a look at Sanchi Stupa in central India. This incredible Buddhist complex was commissioned by Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE, more than a century after the Buddha's parinibbana. It is here at Sanchi where we find one of the most striking examples of aniconic art. Sanchi's carvings never depict the Buddha in human form. Instead, he's symbolized through powerful imagery, like an empty throne or even a riderless horse. For early Buddhists, this wasn't just about the Buddha as a person, it was about his teachings, his path, and the awakening he embodied. Perhaps, too, they avoided human depictions out of reverence, considering that none had seen him in person. But everything changed around the 1st century CE in a region called Gandhara, which lies in present-day eastern Afghanistan and northern Pakistan. At that time, Gandhara had come under the influence of Hellenistic culture, especially from the Indo-Greek and later Kushan rulers. This fusion gave rise to what we now call Greco-Buddhist art, where Hellenistic artistic conventions were integrated into Buddhist iconography. And in this tradition, for the very first time, the Buddha was portrayed as a human being, robed like a Greek philosopher with wavy hair and a serene gaze. Now, you might be wondering, isn't there a story about a bunch of snails that climbed onto the Buddha's head to shield him from the sun? This story has no canonical basis. It's a modern invention with no roots in early Buddhist texts. It's just a bizarre apocryphal tale that someone likely fabricated in the late 19th century, which then gained popularity through internet circulation in the early 2000s. However, the depiction of the Buddha with curled hair originates from ancient artistic conventions, particularly the 32 marks of a great man described in the Lakkhana Sutta. One such feature is hair that curls clockwise. Now, these curls are symbolic and not intended to represent snails in any way. That being said, the curled hair seen on many Buddha statues does have its origins in Gandharan art. Gandhara was instrumental in shaping and spreading Buddhist art throughout Asia, especially in introducing the anthropomorphic depiction of the Buddha. Gandharan Buddha statues, as we have seen, often featured wavy or curly hair styled in a topknot, defined musculature, a toga-like robe, and the contrapposto pose, a pose where the figure stands with most of its weight on one foot, a hallmark of classical Greek sculpture. It's widely accepted among scholars that Gandharan artists took inspiration from Hellenistic Greek art like the Apollo Belvedere sculpture when creating early Buddha images. They also claim that the uniform snail-like curls on most Buddha statues nowadays are actually stylistic remnants of the curly or wavy hair seen in Gandharan art. So remember that top knot that I mentioned on the Buddha's head? Turns out it's not really a top knot. It's called an Ushnisha, a three-dimensional cranial protuberance that symbolizes the Buddha's supreme wisdom, a feature that also happens to be one of the 32 marks of a great man. Though it resembles a hair bun visually in many sculptures, it's meant to represent a spiritual attribute rather than a hairstyle. Because many art styles show the Ushnisha as a raised bunch of hair, it's natural for people to mistake it for a top knot. That being said, later interpretations fuse the Ushnisha with stylized hair, contributing to modern misunderstandings. So, to conclude, was the Buddha bald? Historically, yes. Symbolically and artistically, not exactly. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if the Buddha was bald or not. The veracity of the Dhamma remains unchanged. The supreme preacher of the Four Noble Truths is not invalidated by the presence or absence of his hair. Thanks for watching the Bodhi Files. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more Buddhist deep dives. Until then, take care.